Very happy to introduce this this panel. I'm not going to spend much time. I'm not going to spend any time, in fact, on the biographies, except to say that this is a very unusual group in that for the first time we've had panels like this in the past, but now we're very happy to have the Coast Guard represented here, especially in this particular space. They've gotten active, and I think Steve's going to help us with that. It is my honor to have my friends and colleagues here, and I think without further ado, we'll get started on the panel. A conversation rather than the normal thing where you have one guy talk for 15 minutes and then goes on for that. We're going to start with a conversation, and I think given the title of our conference, and I do want to get into some things that maybe aren't explicitly cyber, but just generally, if you could just give me the thumbnail sketch of your service and how you view the role of cyber and specifically the role of JAGs in there. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you because you were taking a drink of something, and I wanted to make it as awkward as I could.
No, I think that's a wonderful start because, of course, in the Air Force, we think we own cyber because it's in our mission statement. And we always tell the other services the very same thing. And I think that is a key point in that what we try to bring to the joint force from a domain standpoint is how do you command and control across domains, and how do you use cyber to support the joint warfighter, and how do we all come together to do that? So in the Air Force, of course, we view airspace and cyber as our core missions and how we do those core missions. So it's and how we bring that to the joint warfighter. So very important to us.
For the Navy, our cyber strategy is really focused more on the traditional Navy missions, essentially dealing with sea control and power projection. General Rockwell talked about cyber as a domain, and it's articulated that way in many doctrinal publications, including a reference in the Law of War Manual. I read an article once that I can't cite to you, but the author talked about cyber not only as a domain, but as a substrate that underlies every domain, the maritime, the land, and the air. And I think there's a lot of truth in that as I think about the development of cyber. If we only limit it to acting in a domain, I think we lose the real effect and the reality that every single combat system that's connected, all of our command, control, and communications really matter in this arena. And so the substrate idea for me has been a very powerful thought along with the domain element.
Tom, what about the Army?
Well, first, Charlie, thanks for inviting all of us. You know, I was reminded by Norm Allen out there, the SJ of Central Command, Special Operations Command, Central Command, I'm sorry. Yes, Special Operations Command, as I said 3 times.
Yeah, I tried to talk to him about his handshake. It needs to get a little little more. Need to work that hand.
Well, he reminded me those who do and those who talk about it. So we're here talking about it. But thanks so much for the offer to talk about it. And what's difficult to talk about cyber operations is, of course, that so many things are classified. And so I think when we talk about the Army's take on it, there are certain things that are very classified and they're at the national level. And so we see some true expertise in providing legal advice for those things that have to come to the national level. But I think in the Army we're seeing now that in our operations, in current operations in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, you have real-time operations and you have lawyers down at the on-the-ground level who have to give advice because so many things are going on. And the enemy, we know, uses cyber to communicate. And it gets very complicated very quickly because the enemy knows that we can do things in a combat zone but there are things, so they try to use cyber platforms that are not in the combat zone. And so there has to be good coordination between the on-the-ground tactical level and the strategic level. And so for us, it is it's an interesting area. It takes great collaboration from the unit level all the way up to the strategic level. And then it's not just in the combat zones right now, but it's also as we're not only fighting the current fight, but we're preparing for other fights. We're deterring in Europe, we're deterring in the Pacific, and we're thinking about what warfare would be like in those regions against near-peer competitors or rogue states. And so we know they're going to use cyber.
Yeah, Tom, you've recently written an article, as a matter of fact, where you're talking about sort of these gray area wars. So could you share with us a little bit about that?
Sure. The article you're talking about, I wrote about in Colombia, the fact that the professionalism of the Colombian forces really became a center of gravity. They're showing that they abided by the laws of war in their operations against the FARC. That's how they gained respect and admiration of the Colombian people, and that again became the center of gravity. And so that's very important. But now, after hostilities, as you've got a peace agreement, you know, there's always a desire for truth and reconciliation when you've come to the end of hostilities, and people look back, and they want to look back in 20/20 hindsight, and they want to, you know, look at decisions that were made under kind of combat operations perspective, and they want to pick those apart. And we've got to be careful how we do that. So I'd say the same is true in the cyber area. You know,
That's what I was thinking, because it suggested to me, you know, you have two different legal regimes operating: the human rights law legal regime, essentially law enforcement, as well as the law of armed conflict. And I think that's going to be. We're talking about Colombia today, but it could be anywhere tomorrow, especially in the cyber realm.
Yeah, Charlie, what I'd say, you know, in Colombia, and I think it is applicable to the cyber area, you know, for a long time, the soldiers out there, they had two rules of engagement cards. They had a blue rules of engagement card, so when they came up against a narco trafficker, you know, they had to use police rules, force as last resort, and only proportional force. You know, if they pull out a knife, you know, you pull out a knife rather than a weapon. So, but then you've got, they also were against this insurgency, they were in warfare, right, against the FARC, who was armed, well-armed, and so you could use force as first resort when you have an identified threat. And so I think the same thing goes, you know, when we're talking about cyber. Which scheme are we talking about? We just heard a great presentation, but many of that was in the law enforcement scheme. But I think we need to think also about laws of armed conflict and a force as first resort when we have an identified enemy and we know what they're doing.
Steve, just talking about different legal regimes. Number one, I'm really glad that you're here. It's way overdue. We should have had you and people from the Coast Guard earlier. But just not everyone may know. Could you talk a little bit about the different legal scheme that the Coast Guard operates under, and what your take is on the role of how cyber is being integrated, given that you're in the Department of Homeland Security and so forth?
So happy to do that. Humbled to be here, and thanks for having me. So cyber, just as a general sense, pervades everything we do now in the Coast Guard. And about 18 months ago, we issued our cyber strategy for our service. And one of the things that makes us a little bit different is, and we've talked about some of it here, so we're, you know, look at us, we're a military service, that's sort of obvious, but we are also have law enforcement authority, which makes us a little bit different. We've talked about some of that. The other area, particularly in cyber, that we spend a lot of time and attention on is we are also a regulatory agency. So we regulate the marine transportation system, which is about a $4.5 trillion event in our country, because 90% of the goods that come into our country come by way of the maritime transportation system. So whether it's a vessel with all their integrated industrial control systems, whether it's a port facility like the Port of LA, LB, which is huge, and if you recall, several years ago we had a labor dispute that shut it down for several days, the ripple effect that sends through the economy, you know, something similar in the cyber world would have a similar effect. We've put a lot of emphasis on cyber, and we're probably a little bit behind the other services, when it comes to how we're evolving. We've just recently declared within the Coast Guard, cyber as an operational domain, much like our cutters, like our aircraft. We're treating it that way. We have stood up a Coast Guard Cyber Command, which has a Coast Guard flag officer in charge who also happens to be a judge advocate.
Oh, really?
So, and I think that was deliberate. We, as far as our judge advocates in the Coast Guard, we are initiating a program to bring them all up to a basic level of proficiency in cyber. No matter what you're doing, you need to have a basic level of proficiency. And then we have some, including Lieutenant Commander Rice, who's here with me today, who we are sending for LLM programs in cyber law to increase our proficiency in that area.
Speaking of young talent, what are you looking for? I'm asking this to the whole panel. Given the increasing importance of cyber, is that a factor when you recruit people, or is it a factor when you try to retain them? And how is recruiting and retention going? John, do you want to dive into that one?
Yeah, so, our recruiting scheme involves, number one, we do a lot of active engagement throughout the judge advocate community. And once we screen someone and give what's called a professional recommendation, we then hand the person off to the Navy Recruiting Command to take through the application and the physical, medical requirements, et cetera. One of the unique things about our program is we use a structured interviewing technique. It used to be that an applicant would just have to have a personal interview with the senior judge advocate. And not surprisingly, we found that so many of those at the end of the application would be a statement along the lines of, best applicant I've ever interviewed, right? And when you put a lot of those to an accession board, it's really hard to make meaningful distinctions. And so we think the structured interview process, which involves standard questions and answers that are graded on a similar scale by trained interviewers, can take some of the bias out of the process and give us a better means of assessment. Now, are we looking for cyber talent right off the bat? At some point, I think there may be an element of that.
So you might go up to 10 questions instead of the...
Yeah. We'd have to refine the Q&A for that one, obviously. The challenge right now, obviously, is the education and the training level, right? To get to a trained cyber person who we could take in and put in an operational command, it also requires a lot of work within the service before you're ready to do that. You mentioned retention, and for us, developing cyber lawyers, those who are familiar and effective in that operational environment, is the focus area right now. Using more junior billets where people gain exposure to cyber principles, and also how policy interacts at various levels, and then using that experience and that talent when they do get to more senior levels in an effective way. And retaining those lawyers is critical.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about retention in a minute. I do want to say that I must say the Navy's been very successful at Duke Law School because we have a record number of graduates going into the Armed Forces, 5, which is a lot for in a law school at this level, and 3 of them are going in the Navy, 2 of them are going in the Army. Rock, we got some work to do here, so, and now I think when people hear more about the Coast Guard, we got even more competition, and that's all good. Let's talk about retaining people generally, but specifically with these unique cyber talents. Tom, why don't you start off?
Can I also just talk about, a lot of you are influencers, some of you are law students. I would say to the previous question, the Army is hiring. We're bringing on 160 attorneys. The Army is growing, so we'll bring on 160 new attorneys just this year. And so it is a great place to start. I would say in the past, we had many who wanted to come into the JAG Corps because they wanted trial experience. They wanted litigation experience. We now have many that are very interested in the issues of international law and national security. And what I would say to them is, this is a great place to serve. This is a great place to have a career. You may not get to do it your very first job. You know, you're going to have to learn the business of being a military attorney for a while before you're going to get to work in these specialties. Now, that's true 95% of the time. You know, sometimes, though, you might immediately go to a place, to a unit that's going into an active operation and where you're going to be doing these things. So I would say on the issue of retention, our biggest retention draw is the people you work with and the types of challenging, interesting issues you work on. People who come onto our team, they know they're part of a team, and they want to stay with the team. And so that is fantastic. Our biggest challenge is that many of the people who want to stay on the team and they're doing these interesting issues, even if they have great cyber skills and experience, that they could go to a law firm or they could go somewhere else and make more money, they'd rather stay with the team because how important it is. And our challenge of keeping even those people on is, though, they're usually married to somebody who's also a professional, and the military requires that we move them around. So we're really working hard on that issue as well.
Yeah, my experience, and I want to ask you, Rock, what's going on with the Air Force, and is that very few people get out of the JAG Corps because they don't like the work. They usually, it's very often a family thing, and the dual career couple is a challenging piece of it. And I think the Coast Guard has some initiatives in that regard, but let's hear from Rock first.
Yeah, let me collapse the recruit and the retain piece of this, because, you know, what's changed? I think everything's changed. I think we're at a point now in the law that we don't even know where we are. And Mr. Carlin mentioned it when he was prosecuting cases, and he was working with the FBI, and he went behind that war room, and they had a big data board, and all this stuff was happening. I don't think we have any concept of that, especially the old gray-haired guys on the panel and in the room. So the way we collect facts, relevant facts, the way we do the analysis of those facts, we got a lot to learn from you guys. We've really, so it's almost like a partnering, which is a weird thing in the military because I'm smarter than you, right? Because I'm older. No, I'm not. I have no idea how to get those facts like you do because you grew up in a different age and a different era that we haven't grasped onto yet. Now, do we know more about the law than you? Yeah, just by attrition. I mean, we're old. So there's an interesting partnering going on that the practice of law hasn't changed. For us, it's still mission-driving facts and us driving the facts through this process of critical analysis we call law. But until we grasp how we do that big data analysis and how we get the, you know, what's relevant, what's credible, what are those facts, and the speed that we have to operate on to do that, we won't be where we need to be. So when you give folks that opportunity coming in and then give them that type of work, they'll overcome everything. They'll overcome the fact that, you know, we've got dual incomes and all those things because it just makes it that much neater what you get to do for national security.
Well, what about some of these initiatives, and this is what I'm referencing, of allowing people to get out for a couple of years and so forth? My question about that is, given, especially if they have some cyber expertise, do you really think you're going to get them back? You know, Steve?
So don't know in the cyber realm because we haven't done it in that particular practice area, but I would say we're probably about 50-50. We have a program in the Coast Guard where we allow people to temporarily separate. Initially started as for maternity purposes, but now it's applied across the board. And we have attorneys who go to work to be special assistant U.S. attorneys, and they'd say, hey, I want to stick around here, and they get out for 2 years. Sometimes they stay out, they stay affiliated with reserves. Sometimes they come back to the Coast Guard. They find out, I tried it, got a taste of it, but I think I want to be back for the Coast Guard. And so we're about 50-50. As far as just the general question about recruiting and retention, I don't think we're having any challenges recruiting, but I always am looking to up our numbers of applicants that we get. We only bring in about 15 judge advocates a year, so a much smaller number, and we're also always looking for good talent. And for me, and particularly in the area of cyber, not everybody who comes in the Coast Guard, and very few are going to be actually practicing in that area on a regular basis. And most of our attorneys that do practice in this area are doing it as a collateral because we just don't have the size. But I'm looking for specifically people not only who we think can function in a military environment, which sometimes, as you know, tends to be a little constraining, but also people that can balance that with critical thought, innovative thought, particularly in this area, because just the opportunities are unlimited. And some of the things that the previous speaker talked about how to break down the walls between law enforcement and the intelligence community and those different authorities that we have in the Coast Guard. Some of the things we have done, and that's a good example, that we're also a member of the intelligence community, so we have those authorities. We also have law enforcement authorities, and traditionally there's been somewhat of a wall between those two. In many cases, it's something that's been self-imposed. And there are ways to not get around it, but to work within that I think that's where, when I'm looking for bringing people in the Coast Guard, people who have the drive, the motivation to help us figure out some of those challenges.
What about in the Navy? How retention specifically?
Our retention is good. I don't know the exact numbers, but from year to year, 90+% of people are judge advocates one year, are judge advocates the next year. As to the question of, could you get to the point where you can offer the more lenient out and in? I think there are people who would get out, do something else for a few years and want to come back in. The data point I use is that there are some judge advocates that we hire are what we call the direct appointments, who have practiced in the civilian world for a few years and look at the military as an attractive option to continue service in the civilian sector. I think the bigger challenge for us is putting enough flexibility in our manpower system so that even though the numbers of 04s and 05s and 06s we can have on active duty are limited, that we can have the space and flexibility to move them back in.
Thinking about the rise of cyber, and it's interesting to hear you talk about it going across many different aspects. There's been some discussion about having a separate cyber force, in other words, another armed force which is focused on cyber. And there's also been discussion, and I just would remind everybody that you're all speaking in your personal capacities here, about whether the NSA should be a military entity or not. Given its role in surveillance and so forth. It is part of the Department of Defense. It's headed by a military officer. I think there are judge advocates that are assigned over there. But given the changing nature and a lot of things of what John talked about, would it be better to have that as a civilian agency, meaning outside of the armed forces? Or what do you think?
I'll tell you what. I'm only jumping in because I want to answer the easier question. I don't want to touch the NSA thing with a 10-foot pole.
You could be famous, Rock.
Infamous, yeah. We talked a little bit about it from a domain standpoint, and that tends to drive who we are, right? And we talk a lot about overlapping and should it be a separate combatant command under Goldwater Nichols or a separate service that then supports the domain. I mean, when you look at these uniforms up here and you look at the evolution of Westphalian sovereignty and principles of that and why we created forces to take care of a domain, to exploit a domain, to defend a domain, you see that evolve over 500-600 years, right? With the Army to defend, protect, and exploit land, the Navy, sea, and the Coast Guard, the littorals, and the Air Force, air and space. And you had this evolution of domains that we're used to thinking about. And those domains have this spatial nature to them. You can reach out and touch, they're physical, right? So if they're physical, and whether you're a military or a business, that's all you do is defend and exploit. That's what it's all about. It's as simple as that. So you had this evolution until we got into this thing that we called cyber, and it just doesn't fit into that Westphalian concept of sovereign, non-sovereign, sovereign, free space, navigation, all that. So we struggle with it as lawyers. And so we rail against it and we push against it and we make these decisions. How do we organize to defend and exploit that domain based on this construct and this paradigm that's evolved over 500 years? So we as lawyers say it's not really a domain, it really overlays the existing domains. And that's where we get, well, if that's the case, why do we need a separate command to do it? Well, everybody knows the practical answer to that. If you don't call it a domain, you won't exploit it, you won't defend it. And as Mr. Carlin pointed out, businesses are exploiting and defending it. So you have to. You don't fill it with resources. You don't create that team that from 8 to 5 actually defends and exploits that domain. So that's where we are in this question of, do you create a separate organization? That terrifies us, because what lawyers do in the military a lot is half law, half bureaucratic, figuring out all these different rice bowls you got to jump over. So is that the right answer? I think I probably told you what I think just with that editorial comment, so I'll stop there and get in trouble later.
Well, and I'll just add, before we cede all of cyber to the Air Force, because it's in their mission statement. Yeah.
I'm here to support you, though.
Yeah, I know you are. You always are. In the air and in cyber. So, again, I'd say let's look at our enemies and what they're doing, and let's think about how they're using cyberspace. So, you look at ISIS, or you look at even near-peer competitors. So we used to do command and control, intelligence, and then communications right through a contained military network. In the old days, it was passing notes, it was maps, it was those kinds of things. And then it grew to a network that was a military network that you could try to attack through electronic warfare or by, putting bombs on pieces of steel that were sending military network waves. Now you've got the enemy who's, they're using apps to talk to each other. They're using apps to gather intelligence. They're using apps to do their command and control or their operations. And those apps, have spider-like webs into servers in multiple countries. And so to just cede it all to a non-military agency to take over when it's so integrally linked now in our military operations in targeting an enemy, we'd be very concerned with that kind of movement. Because this is really about how our enemy and our enemies in the future will operate.
Steve, you live in an agency, you live outside the Department of Defense, and you live in an agency which, except there are uniformed elements of it, but you're the military element, so to speak, in there. How is that different, and do you have any thoughts on, given the integration of cyber and everything that John Carlin talked to us about, how it's impacting corporations, do you have any thoughts on how the United States should organize itself in that regard? Or at least tell us what it's like being inside a different organization like Homeland Security, because they have a different perspective.
Yeah, so on the second part of your question about how we should organize, I think that, PPD, 41 sort of gives us a good initial framework to work from, and about who does threat response and who does mitigation, and particularly across civilian or non-DoD agencies. But working within DHS, sometimes I like to consider it, we get the best of both worlds, and sometimes we get the worst of both worlds. And so the best of both worlds, like I said, military service, that's great. And so we can work well with our military colleagues. And typically we are relying on them for a lot of what we do, particularly in the cyber arena. Although we have contingents at NSA, we have contingents placed within the various military organizations and the intelligence community on a very small level because we're so much smaller. But being law enforcement, being intelligence community, being regulatory, and armed force allows us in the Coast Guard, I think, to really be comfortable operating in the interagency, which is that's we are squarely fit in the interagency. That's where we spend most of our time. That's where we spend most of our effort, although we still have the military connection. And so that's sort of the best of both worlds. The worst, and one example in cyber, is that, for example, we are on the Department of Defense Information Network, the DODIN, but we work for DHS, which is on the .gov. And so it's sometimes in that category, if you have two masters, and just trying to sort out what are the requirements that our IT infrastructure has to comply with. Is it DoD? Is it DHS? Is it both? Can be very difficult and challenging. And in that area, recently the DHS and DoD entered into an agreement, largely that was written by Coast Guard judge advocates, to sort of sort through the lines of who, when it comes to cyber, who do we report to? Whose standards are we enforcing on our systems?
You know, Chuck, no, but it's interesting underneath the question that you asked of how the Coast Guard has always been a bit schizophrenic and had these dual functions, and watching us, the other services, over the last 20 years migrate to the way the Coast Guard's always been. So we've learned a lot from the Coast Guard, and two major things made us do that. And it was really manifested on 9/11. We could always project force outside the country. 9/11 was the first time the country's attacked, and when the country's attacked, you no longer have the seas anymore to protect you. Hell, we can't even project anymore to take the war elsewhere. It's on the mainland. And it's been interesting from a philosophical standpoint to see us migrate more to the way the Coast Guard functions in that duality of both law enforcement and national security, which does challenge what you always talk about, Charlie, which is, you know, civilian control of the military, and how do we check that and keep that in check?
Well, which does remind me, with the growth of social media and, you know, millennials in the armed forces, I think it really is a lot different. Like when I came in, the big thing would be underground newspapers, but that was an easy problem compared to social media and so forth. I'd like to hear from the panel, what do they think about that challenge when every troop might have a blog post or a Facebook page, and so you have security issues, you have policy issues, you have disciplinary issues. What do you think?
Yeah, just a few comments. I think, you know, every technology can be used for good or for evil. And I think in a
like
large
the law.
respect, you don't have a choice. I mean, you know, innovation is being driven by industry. People are growing up with new capabilities of communicating. We can use that in so many ways to our advantage. But it presents some challenges. You know, when you think of the social media, the first presentation, Mr. Carlin talked about it very well. There are things that you can do now that you used to have to get together in person to do, and you no longer have to get together in person. And that affects us in the cultural aspect, cyberbullying and other things like that. The other interesting thing, I think, from a more law enforcement, criminal justice standpoint, is when you think about, again, Mr. Carlin pointed out this dichotomy between the desire for privacy on the one hand, and yet what I see is the willingness of people to openly use social media. And so when you think about, in all of our criminal cases now, where does the evidence lie? Well, it's in social media, right? Who created that evidence? Well, oftentimes, the person who allegedly committed the crime. And so we have to make adaptations to that. The other challenge, I think, with social media, and this goes to the 24/7 news construct that operates as well. It reminds me of what a senior leader commented on the third offset strategy, which OSD is putting into place for the kind of next generation technologies. And this senior leader said what it really means to that person is do everything faster. And there's a temptation, right, to do everything faster, but we all know that so many times the first report is wrong. And you need to get the second report in order to get the corrected facts. And so how do you both move faster, be prepared to respond when you need to, but yet don't move so fast that you aren't giving your commanders a little more deliberative, thoughtful advice?
Yeah, I think that is it's a real operational issue, because the ability to execute an action is is not allowing that space to think about the action. We see that in the Air Operations Center. Tom?
Yeah, I want to, to answer your question too. There's a story, December 22nd, 2016, again, not to talk classified stuff, but so stuff that's in the news, that talks about that the best link of the Russians to the hack of the DNC was an Android malware called CrowdStrike that got hacked by the Russians. And so the story behind that is you have a Ukrainian officer who developed an app in the fight against the separatists and the Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. He developed an app so that he could line up his howitzers more quickly. And so rather than about a minute it would take to line up the howitzers and to fire, they could do it in 15 seconds. And then he tried to secure that app and again, communications and command and control on an app with cell phones. He tried to secure that with a piece of software called CrowdStrike, right? And so you love that type of innovation, right? And we need to foster that in the future conflicts, solving problems at the ground level. But then the Russians hacked CrowdStrike to get inside his app, and within a few weeks, there was an 80% reduction in the number of howitzers that the Ukrainians had, because they all got counter-fired and counter-struck. So that's the danger of then people using media and innovating and using the cyberspace, that it becomes a liability as well. So I think, in the future, just what John talked about, the third offset strategy, our second offset strategy was precision guided munitions, where no one could compete with us, right? But now precision guided munitions have become so ubiquitous and so cheap that everyone's got them. And so that means you can't be seen. You're going to have to be in smaller packets. And these smaller packets of troops are going to have to not be seen. They're going to have to be independent. They're going to have to innovate. They're going to have to make decisions. They're going to have to comply with the rules of law, do the morally, legally, and ethically right thing, even though they're groups at 10 and 12. And so all that, is very interesting in terms of looking for people who can innovate, who can make the right decisions at the right time, and how we train them, how we ensure that they...
Let me follow up on just one piece of that. Soldiers, all troops are taking their phones to the field. And so that gives them a chance to
Including
record.
the adversary.
Including the adversary. But it gives our troops the opportunity to record things. What are the services doing there's OPSEC issues, there's political issues, because this will come as a shocker. Sometimes young men under great stress do things that, maybe young men and women too, that maybe we wish they didn't do. What are the services doing about that, if anything?
We stopped trying to control it, I've noticed, just because you can't. And there's some folks who came out of the CENTCOM and other AORs out there who can tell you how they tried to control it, and it's almost futile. If, the 24/7 news cycle, cyber, the social media platforms, they're with us. That ability to then shoot that photo, we see it a lot in our roles because we're inside the Beltway, and it ends up on some congressman's desk or senator's desk, or in some press, and you pick which one you like. And that has strategically really challenged what the military uses to get stuff done. And for those of you in uniform, you know this, but that basic command authority, command and control, that ability to command and control a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guardsman to execute mission, it really challenges that. because as soon as you can go outside that with that picture, man, you've just upset that apple cart. And in the past, you couldn't upset that apple cart because it took a letter to your congressman, right? Or if an airman has to sit down and pen a letter, they ain't going to do it. Not that they're lazy. They've just got other things to do. But, man, if you can thumb it away, it's there. That has really forced command authority and a command chain to talk up and down the chain, which is a healthy thing. John mentioned it, though, and as a lawyer, and this is a pure legal answer, wow, the facts are so much clearer now. If you want to get to the bottom of anything that happened, it's right there in front of you. And based on those elements of primacy and recency and excited utterances, we all change our story as time goes on. I mean, I'm more brilliant today than I was yesterday because we change our story. And to fit our perception of reality, social media, man, it gives it to you right there. Does that make it difficult answering law of war violations? Yeah, but that's our job, is to answer those. But, man, it's a lot easier when it's clear in front of you. And that's what social media does for us. I don't think we can control it, though, to answer your question.
Like we have policies generally, but the benefits outweigh the risks in our term. And so our equivalent of, I guess, a soldier taking a picture in a war zone is a Coast Guardsman or Coast Guard woman taking a picture on 10,000 pounds of cocaine and telling a story about how that happened. And we just deal with those, one of, because...
Of course, that could be a good story for
well, it's a good story when it shows up in the newspaper. It's a bad story when it shows up of how to get there, what were our tactics involved in getting it. But the reason I mention our adversaries is because, as much as our folks or our people might be using social media, so are the bad guys, and we exploit that all the time in our mission, our law enforcement mission, going after transnational organized crime. I know it's exploited as well in the military arena. And, North Koreans, they have phones. Chinese soldiers, they have phones. And I don't know. I almost think it just, in my very limited experience in dealing with that we're probably getting more out of that than we're giving up.
Yeah, interesting thing, I'm reading Tom Friedman's new book on Thank You for Being Late. It's all about technology, and he made the observation. He was in North Africa interviewing a bunch of refugees who had been returned back and how they didn't have any resources and so forth. And at the end, he said, well, can I take a picture of you? And he pulled out his cell phone, and then they all pulled out their cell phones and took a picture of him taking a picture. And I'm thinking, how they get the cell phones? But just goes to show you how ubiquitous it is. And I'm just wondering, it would seem to me, and Rock, you seem to allude to this, it almost changes the relationship between command and the force, because are you finding, Joe Smedlap will email the chief of staff, and the chief of staff actually emails back?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any?
Constantly. That's what I see it as a good thing, just because it's better to live life that way. What it's forced in the Air Force, I've noticed, and especially our last chief of staff, who was he would email everybody. The current one doesn't as much. Makes us happier up there, that's for sure. But what it has forced the chain of command to do, from the chief down to that airman, which is about 10 levels of command, if you will, it has forced that intermediate chain of command to ask itself, how come you're not coming to me, man? And that's a healthy thing, and that has engendered a conversation that's real important. And it's really up to us not to overreact to the VFR direct and violate that chain. That's going to happen, but you want to minimize that. And how do you minimize that? By talking to the airmen up and down the chain.
John?
I think the situation you point out really, it illuminates the need for really good culture and really strong leadership throughout the chain of command. You cannot wait until you're at the 04, 05, or higher level, or the E7, E8, E9 level to understand the importance of training and exercise leadership. The other thing, based on Rock's comment about, the propensity of some to communicate by emails. You know what happens when you get a lot of those, right? At the end of the day, it's a lack of communication. And it's like the use of PowerPoint. People find that, hey, to really get your message across, sometimes you have to write with a problem statement, with facts, with analysis, and really communication, and not just a brief. And I think our leaders need to understand that oftentimes it's not the email. It's the eyes on and understanding, training, and then making sure the troops understand what the key issues are.
Steve, do you have any further? I can see the wheels turning.
It happens every now and then. It's not a huge deal. It's just, and I would much rather have, like you, Brock said, much rather have that small problem in return for the huge benefits we get from the way social media.
I'm just wondering if it's eroding leadership at the lower levels because people can circumvent it. And I think we can do that in a peacetime environment, but if we're in a high-stress combat environment and somebody's second-guessing, what's going on, that there's a luxury at a certain period of time when the chief of staff actually can respond, but that may not be, all the time. I'm not sitting here with a great solution, but.
Well, I would just add, Charlie, that, kind of what Rock and everyone has said is it's about ensuring that you're training character and values at the soldier level, and so that they're imbuing those values in themselves and that they're serving for the right reason. I think, though, one of the interesting outcomes of these emails is that you then have knowledge of problems. And the first question is, just as was said, hey, why did the lower levels know this? Why haven't they done something this? And I think that's become the big boogeyman, too, these days of, who knew when, how often were they advised of this, and do senior leaders take action or not? When you look at Penn State and the sexual assault, who knew when, and did they take action, or did they not look at it? When you look at Florida A&M had a hazing incident, and not only the band leader is fired, but the university president has to resign. So it's not just the military where we're expecting that everybody, senior leaders, will take action when they see a problem, because it's in civilian society too, and I think that's part of the issues of cyber, but I think we have an even greater obligation because we have America's sons and daughters.
This does remind me of another issue. I'd really be interested to hear how you guys deal with it, especially for lawyers. You get copied on a lot of things. How do you deal with that? I've seen, macros that would automatically go back. Thanks for this information. Just because you copied me doesn't mean I've read it or approved it or acquiesced. But I don't know, how does that, because everybody likes to copy a lawyer, because when it hits the proverbial fan, well, hey, I told Rockwell,
Yeah, CYA stands for copy.
Yeah.
So just what you said, so with the people that I work with on a daily basis, I am very explicit about what that means to me. And so they know if I'm on the copy line, there's a good chance I'm not reading it. And, or if you want me to read it, tell me you want me to read it. And so to me, it's just about setting your expectations up front. Do the same thing with clients. And most of the clients that are doing that are having the same things done to them, the non-lawyers. Everybody throw in a copy line that presumes acquiescence, but we generally, that's sort of a slimy tactic in some ways to rely on that, and I don't see that happening a lot in our organization.
Yeah, personally for me, it doesn't bother me to be copied on it. I do ask myself the question, why was I on this email? But if you look at the content, figure out your portfolio, I think the action that you should take often is clear. Sometimes it's engaging one of your subordinates to say, hey, be sure you're in contact with the right people, and if they have a question, that we're answering the question. Other times it might be a signal, hey, I need to engage with my senior leader before the decision gets to X point to be able to inject the legal framework. So that's how I deal with with the copies.
Yeah, and I think when we're on the copy line, many times it's because someone has a spidey sense that there's a legal issue and they're not really sure, right? And so I think in the past, that's a good thing, because in the past, we try to do preventive law, and we try to teach commanders and program managers to come to us when they have a problem. But now they're more willing to just CC us. And so the more we're knowledge of the problem, the more then we can help that preventive law and assist our client to not get into a legal strait.
A little bit related to that, what are you, and it came up earlier, what are you telling the senior commanders about social media, or commanders in general about social media? Do you tell them anything specific, or do you tell them if they're copied? I know I went through a phase when I was telling our then chief of staff, if you get copied on or get something, you know, the automatic response had to be, Bob, sounds good, run it by the lawyers, we do everything by the book around here, because it complicates the inevitable investigation afterwards. Because, you know, the investigations these days are very big data oriented. They will mine thousands and thousands of emails, and things taken out of context can be very, very difficult. Unintended by the senior officer, but nevertheless, there's a there's evidence there.
Well, my boss, Lieutenant General Florida Arpino, is one of the most spoofed personalities in the cyberspace, and she has multiple personalities that are widows who the Army is no longer paying her money, and she needs money, and so you have all these spoof things, and you know, many of our senior officials.
They're saying they're Flora?
They're saying they're Flora, and they're asking for money, and then, you know, and then we have an official space, and so one of the things we tell our senior leaders, it's good to have an official space. So you occupy the space. So at least then when a spoof comes up, you can do a search and you can find the official space that is occupied. And so that, I think, is an important defense strategy in some ways. But even on the official space, then you have people who, and you have to continue to monitor, you have to continue to search for unofficial spaces, because in the official space, people who have been spoofed will say, well, wait, you know, you owe me money because I sent you money, and things like that. So it's very, very interesting.
I think you play the hand you're dealt. Having worked for a couple dozen commanders, you know, they're all different, and some of them are a lot easier than others, that's for sure. But you got your Admiral Stavridis out there, you have your General Welsh's out there who respond to everybody. That's a challenge for the lawyers, because we get all puckered up and we're risk adverse about any of that. And then you got others who just let the organization respond on their behalf too. So yeah, as a lawyer, you play the hand you're dealt. The other, on an aggregate scale though, what I've noticed in the Air Force, at least with Air Force commanders, they're getting away from email communication, and they're either going to Twitter, or they're going to like a blog or a central site that you go to that platform. If it's important, that's a platform you go to. I think that's a healthy migration to get away from email. I think the rest of the world, and they're sitting here going, well, yeah, duh. I think that's a healthy thing. So if it's big and important, and it's like Lawfire, for instance, you know, go to it. You don't need an email for it.
Would you repeat that last line? That could be an order, but now that we're thinking about cyber and so forth, how's it impacting the military justice system? And I'm asking from two different perspectives. Are you seeing cyber crimes, and are they prosecuted in the military justice system, and how well or not well do you think that prepared to do that? And is that really, you know, something for the military justice system? And are there opportunities to improve the military justice system through exploitation of new platforms and so forth, especially looking at the operations or military justice in the deployed areas and aboard ship, you know? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well, we've seen a few cyber crimes, really not that many. Usually it's not soldiers who are involved in cyber crimes. It is somebody code cracking and then playing upon being a soldier or having an Army emergency relief check to get an account. So we are the victims of cyber crimes many times. I think what we see more often is the fact that when we have crimes, there's lots of cyber evidence. And so the digital forensic examination of evidence, you know, everyone these days takes pictures of everything. It didn't happen if you didn't take a picture of it, and you texted about it and you put in Twitter. And so getting those devices and then exploiting those devices for evidence where you can exploit them and the limitations of what the courts will allow and case law will allow. But that is nowadays, the digital forensic evidence is the key evidence in just about every case, and certainly in many sexual assault cases.
That's our challenge as well, is along the lines is making sure we have the capacity to do digital forensics and do it in a timely fashion because you're operating against a trial clock. Haven't seen a lot of specifically cyber crimes, but the cyber element. And then making sure that a prosecutor who may not have had a case before with a lot of digital evidence has enough savvy to present the evidence in a way that's going to be convincing. But not a lot of cyber-specific type crime.
The other part of your question was, you know, can we use it to make the military justice system better? And I think one of the things we've all struggled with is understanding our own work and the pain that data calls impose on everybody. If what you have to do is go back out to the field and ask every prosecution office how many of a certain kind of offenses happened between date X and Y. And that pulls people off their real job, and it's a real challenge. I think we've all made some individual advances there, but there's great work that could be done to have a system where you can work within the system and it tabulates in a big data kind of way so that the data pulls are natural and easy and communicate the kind of information, whether it's to Congress or otherwise, that we need communicated.
We've run into very few instances where the existing law doesn't address the crime. And when you look at cyber is just another method and means of committing a crime. And so you have authentication issues, which I think is a big deal, but those are the same authentication issues we had of evidence that we had 30 years ago when we were, instead of a cyber crime, it was check kiting case or something that I would do in front of Judge Mahoney a long time ago. Difficult then, difficult now, only from a factual standpoint of what does it all mean. But we've run into very few situations where the law isn't there to address, at least from a criminal standpoint. Other areas different.
Well, let's look at another area then. You know, when there's civilian casualties in an airstrike, you know, people see a photograph of a air operations center and it's filled with computers and so forth. I guess it's expectations of what you would immediately have at your fingertips. Are you seeing that? Is there a way to deal with that? Because it seems to me, I don't know, from television and just our own, meaning the military's own representation of itself, it would seem to be easier to get this very detailed information much more quickly than seems to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get into the fairness standpoint. You know, of course, the media and everybody outside who gets that information wants to rush to judgment. And as lawyers, we have to ensure that due process is given and all the equities in the process are taken care of. So you have that stuff out for everybody to see. And in the old days, you didn't have it out to see, so now you have to answer it. And usually you have to be in front of the fact development there and then go into process mode, right, where you explain the process. We're not going to get into the specifics of the adjudication of this particular case, but let me explain how the process works. And when you explain the process, it slows people down and avoids that rush to judgment, whether it's criminal or hitting a target in a war zone.
Steve, you must run into that with criminal cases. You know, people want the information, they've gotten a little bit on, and they think that you have all this data. You know, they've watched NCIS or whatever the Coast Guard equivalent is. And
we don't have a Coast Guard equivalent yet.
Oops, there you have it. but dealing with those expectations of the public.
I don't know that the public is creating a demand signal on the Coast Guard for that type of data. If there is, so think of a big incident, for example, that would happen in our world, where that might come is if
Oil.
so recently, oil spill would be one, and those typically play out, as you know, over a long period of time, and so there's time to develop the record. A large merchant vessel sinks, and recently there was some hearings for the El Faro, which is a large merchant vessel.
Right near here.
Yeah, sank offshore, complete loss of life, and so takes a long time, including time to go down and find the equivalent of the flight recorder, the voice recorder. And so we usually have more time, so the demand signal is not immediate, and we have time to develop the record, to really catch up with sort of the 24-hour news cycle.
Charlie, I think you bring up a great point. It's many in this room probably know, but if you haven't read that there was a strike in Afghanistan against the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz. And so you see that, and people say, how can the military possibly have made that mistake? The Special Forces on the ground, supported by Air Force, they have lawyers at every level. They have perfect intelligence. There's cameras on everything. And so how does that possibly happen? And so, in the heat of combat, in communications, in systems that sometimes go down, electronics don't work all the time. Can you believe that? You sometimes have to reboot systems. Can you believe
shocked.
that? Yeah, I'm shocked. And so, I think that's a very real problem. This just like, every criminal case you see on TV, the evidence is always perfect. So now what's good is that when you're able to lay things out, and so, for instance, in Afghanistan, the team there was able to meet with Doctors Without Borders, lay out the results of the investigation, and Doctors Without Borders says, well, we appreciate the feedback, we appreciate how much you care about this, and we can show, for as many times we make a mistake like that, we similarly sometimes make a mistake where we kill our own soldiers, right? Fratricide incidents. So, we have a desire for care for civilians and to hit the right target all the time. But then Doctors Without Borders will tell you, well, which is different from the other strikes that we've had on our hospitals, where they're purposely struck by Syrian or Russian forces because they know there's a bad guy in the hospital, and which is obviously not allowed under the laws of armed conflict.
Yeah, what struck me about the Doctors Without Borders case is that, they resist using the Protocol 3 sign designations for political reasons with the ICRC. So they're passing GPS coordinates, and, it just is amazing to me that people think that you're going to have a little Afghan guy out there with the GPS and able to operate and even a special forces guy under extreme stress and relying on GPS. I don't think we're there yet in terms of the information atmosphere of real battlefields.
Yeah, I think a 5-gallon can of paint could have saved a lot of lives in that case. Just
Amen.
paint the roof. But at the same point, we need to be held to a high standard, and we need to recognize that if there are organizations out there that aren't going to use that 5-gallon can of paint, then we need to make sure we know where they are and do everything we can to protect lives.
Before I am going to open it up for questions here in just a minute, I do want to ask one more question related to military justice. Do you see opportunities for new thinking on military justice in this respect, more exploitation of communication platforms to conduct military justice in the field? I think the United States is the last country in the world that does significant numbers of military justice actions outside the home territory of the nation concerned. I think the Brits and the Canadians and the Australians, they gave it a shot, but it just was in the too hard to do category. So now the U.S. is the only one left. Do you see any prospect of, more use of video teleconferencing and so forth to do things? How's it working aboard ship?
you know,
You still doing some courts on the bigger ships?
we do some courts on board ship, but it's usually as a matter of discretion. In other words, it could be taken ashore or for matter of convenience. Sometimes it can also be a good demonstration to the crew of the process, right? That we do hold some on board ships, but by and large, they're held on land at our main naval stations where we have prosecution and defense offices and courtrooms. So the use of VTC has certainly expanded over the last few years, but there are some constitutional implications there too that I think there are limits to it. And so I think for us though, the technology part is to be sure that, you know, the evidence you gather that we've talked about, that the case is presented in a way that is meaningful, right, to the jury. And there are some advances there, knowledge management, et cetera, that can be put into the courtroom to make the case presentation better.
Oh, so you are using technologies in the courtroom?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so can I just say, you know, we have to be careful when we compare ourselves to other militaries. I think in many ways, we don't want to be like other militaries. If we would lower ourselves quite a bit if we were like other militaries. We have the preeminent military force in the world, and that's a good thing. Yeah, so let me just tell you, I told a joke one time to, back when our relations were good with the Russians, I told the joke one time to a Russian who had spent a lot of years in Afghanistan. And I feel like I can tell this joke because my grandfather was in World War I in the Italian army. He was captured by the Germans. He used to say, "Tredici mesi," you know, he was in the, so we're not that far away from World War I. My grandfather was a prisoner of war, but he told the joke that, you know, two officers are getting ready to go into battle, and the French officer puts on his red shirt. And the Italian officer says, "Well, why are you doing that?" He says, "Well, if I get wounded, you know, no, my soldiers won't see my wounds, and then they'll continue to follow me. I'll be able to continue to lead them." And the Italian officer says, "Well, I'm going to go put on my brown pants." So, and I told that, you know, it's funny, everyone laughs, right? I told that to the Russian who spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and they're very high-intensity conflict, and he said, he didn't laugh. He'd been laughing. We'd been telling other jokes. You know, maybe some vodka was involved. I don't know. But he didn't laugh. He said, he's the more experienced one. And so you think about that. You know, war at its base level is brutal. It is ugly. It is, you're asking people to do things that is truly unnatural. And so when you're doing that, you know, when somebody sees their buddy get killed right in front of them, and then they're going to take somebody captive 2 minutes later, how are they going to treat that person? You've got to have a system of discipline that travels with that soldier, that is immediate and visible and effective. Otherwise, you're going to have, you know, what we don't want to have. We're going to have an undisciplined force and an armed rabble rather than a very professional army that can fight and win the nation's wars.
You reminded me of something. Many years ago, I wrote a piece where I was forecasting the future, and that sometime in the future, there would be a soldier with his cell phone recording the death in real time and broadcasting it back to the mother of her daughter being killed in real time. That was, you know, a fantastic idea years ago, but now it seems like it could happen, and I think I'm not sure quite how we would deal with that. Steve, did you have anything before we go to questions?
We as far as VTC-like things in the courtroom, we've done on a limited basis. Again, some challenges, constitutional issues, but arraignments, some motions. And mostly we do it because we don't have a large full-time judiciary like some of the other services. So we have a handful of judges and some who are collateral duty in certain locations, and to prevent from flying them all over the place, we have used VTC capabilities in the courtroom.
Let's open it up for questions. Ryan?
So we've talked about the different capabilities of other countries attacking the U.S. and targeting systems and businesses, and most would assume that they also attempt to attack United States military systems as well. at what point, when they're attempting to go at those systems, does it become a law of armed conflict issue, where now we're looking at the safety of the individuals using the system along with those who might be harmed by it?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Comes the Juju's head back.
It's almost, I think it's gotten to the point personally where it's always a law of armed conflict issue. And this goes back to what was discussed by the last speaker with regard to state responsibility, sovereignty and state responsibility, and the interaction between those two things. In fact, the inverse proportionality of those two things. And everybody understands the use of force paradigm, Article 2.4, Article 51, Chapter 6 and 7 operations under the UN Charter and how all that works. And basically, you know, State A respects State B's line of demarcation. Similarly, and I think what is changing dramatically, which is underlying your question, is State B's state responsibility to control what goes on inside its borders. I think that's increasing. And whether it's a state actor, non-state actor, whether it's attributed to the state or not, I think what's evolving right now is this responsibility inside that state to control what they're doing vis-a-vis State A. And you heard that in the Sony case and the things that were talked about. I think that's a bit fascinating when you look at this issue historically, because those two concepts of respecting someone else's sovereignty that's evolved over 500 years, and then a state's responsibility to control what's going on inside its borders, which has been amplified by those two things, technology and the empowerment of non-state actors. I think that responsibility of State B is increasing, which then gets us to drawing those red lines and telling them straight up, if you don't control it, we will. It's almost like the ROE cards that Tom mentioned earlier, right? On a tactical soldier level, that we're gonna have to really develop at a national state-to-state level, state to state, which is very important, which is the fundamental basis of state responsibility, and maybe quell or push back on this rise of the non-state actor and put it on the state's back to control that. And we'll develop, I think, at a national level exactly what those cards say, red and blue, which really, I tell you, I'm so confused right now of when it's a military action and when it's a civil action. I'm really confused when you tell me, thank me for my service, when I look back at you and say, oh, no, it's the other way around, thank you. We're all in this together now, it seems like, based on not having the oceans anymore and the attack on the homeland. Different paradigm. We're in a different world, and we haven't grasped it yet. Yeah. All right.
We have a question from the overflow room, and I'd like to, from Eleanor Mullins from UNC Chapel Hill. And her question is, for those of us with previous experience who are coming to law school later in life, what civilian opportunities are there for working in the services?
Let me just say, we have 1,800 full-time uniformed active duty lawyers, but we have 627 civilian attorneys in the Army, and that's under the TJAG. There's others in General Counsel and the Army Corps of Engineers and Army Material Command. So there are plenty of opportunities to serve the nation as a civilian attorney. And even if you don't want to be a civilian attorney and you feel like you're a little older, we have age waivers for in uniform as well. So we take even some folks who are a little seasoned.
Especially if they have some cyber
So less opportunities. Obviously, we don't have that many in the Coast Guard, but still we have our subject matter experts are typically civilian attorneys because they stay around and they're not rotating. And those of us in uniform tend to, our culture is you get assigned somewhere, you do a job for a couple years, 4 years, you get really good at it, and then you go somewhere else and you maybe do a different job. But our civilians stay in place. They're our subject matter experts. In fact, we're getting ready to advertise for a civilian position in D.C. to be who is our sort of our intelligence law and potentially cyber law subject matter expert civilian position. We don't have a lot, but we rely on them very heavily, particularly in international and operational law.
We have another question from Jordan Monroe from Coastal Carolina University, and this is to the whole panel. What is your perspective or opinion on the idea that the next battle space could be cyber rather than ground, air, and sea? I think what Jordan might be referring to is, could we see, would you expect reasonably to see a conflict which took place entirely in cyberspace, or at least predominantly in cyberspace? Or do you think we're not quite there yet, or are we?
Just some personal thoughts. I mean, I can see conflict certainly escalating first in the cyber realm. Starting there to maybe test a state and what their responses will be, and using a variety of cyber actions to see if there is going to be a response and at what point. But then I think everybody's got their own decisions to make, and once there is, I think from the U.S. perspective, the active force that might trigger the right of self-defense, then it's not necessarily going to remain in the cyber domain. It could, but it might not. And but I think the choice of cyber as an easy way to escalate and to test is probably where we'll see some conflicts either come to the point of initiation, but then, like I said, there's decision points that different states will make.
I see it more as a method and means rather than an actual domain. We're going to measure it by an effect it has in an existing spatial domain, whether that's taking down a satellite, an airplane, a ship, or a tank. And we'll measure it by what effect that has, and the cyber will just be a method and means of doing that. Whether it's an electron or a nuclear weapon, it's still the same measurement under the use of force and laws of war that we know already exists under Geneva and Hague.
One of the things I'll just add is this is, I'm glad he asked that question because I brought a video to illustrate the answer. But you may have been wondering why I have this fake, partially fake round up here. It's because this is the challenge I've given to our operational law attorneys, because I do think that a lot of what we do, the Coast Guard is 226 years old, and we've been doing some things a certain way for almost 226 years. We have a ship, whether it's made of wood or steel, whether it has diesel engines or sails. We go out and we do things, we interdict or we keep things safe on the high seas by having a presence there on a ship. And particularly in the drug law enforcement world, that's exactly how we're doing. Now, our tools have gotten better over the 226 years. Our intelligence has gotten incredibly better, but we still are sending a vessel out. And lots of times, Lisa, if you could just run this is a 13-second video I'll run a couple times, and you can see this is sort of the process that ends up in the end result of one of these 50 caliber rounds coming from that sniper rifle being shot into those outboard engines, which are on these 30-foot, we call them lanchas or pangas, that have lots of cocaine on. And so to deliver a $1.50 round, it requires a highly precision rifle. The trigger's pulled by a highly trained gunner's mate who is in a very expensive helicopter that is launched from an even more expensive cutter that is 1,000 miles offshore. And so, and that works, and we've gotten very good at it. I think last year we did this about once a week. We used our helicopters to deliver one of these in an outboard round to seize about 400,000 pounds of cocaine last year, and over 500 people that were arrested as a result and went through the U.S. prosecutions by the Department of Justice. But, so here's what I've challenged my folks to do is, okay, we don't know all the tools we might be able to have. We know some of the tools because they're currently being used mostly by DOD. But how do we make sure, particularly in our law enforcement realm, that the authorities we have today are supportive of us? Instead of using one of these, we hit a key, or we do something else to stop, rather than taking a round. There's risk involved in that, and most of the times our sharpshooters are good shots, but things fly off of engines, and we've had drug smugglers who have been injured There's not a lot of outcry about that, not surprisingly. But it's still, we don't want to hurt anybody because it's not deadly force, it's a use of force. But if we could do that remotely from a keyboard, then we're talking more like a search and rescue case than we are, because we have to go find these people and pick them up and they'd be disabled. But, and I think that can be done because they're not using, pull Evinrude engines. They're using highly technical, brand new, disposable to them, Honda engines. They're using highly technical navigation equipment. And the challenge I have for our folks is let's think of what's the art of the possible in cyber. What are the things we could do that maybe even would change the way our service operates in the maritime environment? And let's make sure, or let's start thinking about what authority do we need to get now so we can do something like that in the future.
Can I just 60 seconds add on to that? I think that the future is ever more legally intensive, particularly in combat. I mean, I think we're at an inflection point now in history similar to before World War I. Before World War I, you're moving from muscle power and horsepower to mechanized power. And so in that 4 years of World War I, you went from, no tanks and you went from barely being able to fly where the Wright flyer, had the tail in front of the wings to by the end of World War I, they were figuring out how to shoot a machine gun through propellers, right, in 4 years, and air-to-air combat and everything else. So now you've got a few little robots out on the battlefield. You've got a few instances of cyber warfare. You've got some drones and the enemy even using, unmanned aerial vehicles. But how that is going to spread in the future is, I think, if we're in a battle for survival and we put all of the resources of the nation into it, as we had to do in World War I and World War II, the revolution in arms is going to be very quick.
Tom just said something that I hadn't thought of this before until he said it. He gets this out of me. This is interesting because the Air Force was born out of World War I. And it was born based on this concept of over rather than through, right? Because of trench warfare. Cyber brings us back to through, which is kind of an interesting evolution from going above to get through, now back on the ground, or now we'll go, but instead of going above or around, we can kind of permeate through, which is a thing we're wrestling with right now as we evolve this capability.
Are there I have two questions from opposite ends of the spectrum. First is, are there possibly too many lawyers within the military whereby operations may get restricted or cut down? The second question is, sorry guys, it's a little political. We have a new administration coming in who may be looking to go the extra legal way in order to advance our military. And what are your thoughts on that?
So my classmate and good buddy, H.R. McMaster, wrote the book Dereliction of Duty that talks about if there's people who go the extra legal way, that, your choice is then to resign, right? So I think that's all I need to say about the political thing. I'd say your question on too many lawyers, I think that is one of my biggest things that keeps me awake at night is every commander knows things are legally intensive and complex, so they want their lawyer next to them. They don't want to make a decision until their lawyer has talked. And then you've got lawyers at every level of command, and you sometimes need to go through those level of command. So does it slow our operations? So the thing for us to do then is to collaborate across the services, because many times you're talking about joint commands, you're talking about CAOCs, you're talking about other services. And so we, as attorneys, we're usually very good about that in DOD. We collaborate very well. We just need to make sure we collaborate quickly, and we don't need a new, from the start, legal review at every level. Let's benefit from each other and in parallel staffing and synergistic effect of building off each other.
I want the lawyers in the Coast Guard at the point of decision-making for the operational commander, and they want them as well. And I think I had one of our, a client who had, a person who had been in the Coast Guard for an extended period of time tell me the other day, sort of that he has seen the evolution of our legal practice or of the value of lawyers go from, no one ever got fired for saying no to get to yes, and it's been clear to him that, and made me very happy that the lawyers in our service, and I think all those services, are functioning from a let's get to yes. What does the operational commander want to do? Let's make that our highest priority, and then let's figure out a way we can do that within the bounds of the law. There are some times you can't, but most of the times, in my experience, you can.
And real quick, my experience has been that many commanders have expressed appreciation for what a lawyer brings to understanding the framework, and also their ability to communicate, as Tom indicated, up the chain of command to know what's already been looked at a certain level that the commander can now feel confident where they can press ahead. So I think in many cases it's a doubt removing benefit rather than imposing more hurdles on activities.
This is a good question because you're getting 4 answers. You hit a nerve. To answer your first question, absolutely not. We don't have too many lawyers in the military. The second part of your question is interesting because I think we're going back to our natural roles as lawyers in the military, which is questioning. But I mean, never going to the point where, no, you can't do that. We can always find a way to get to something legally, but you could probably look at the way we've operated over the last 10 years or so, and we're almost like sticking up for things as opposed to questioning matters inside. And as Steve mentioned, it's important that we're at the pointy end of the spear raising issues, what if, at that point of the decision making. And I think we're migrating back to that role as administrations change and politics change and they go back and forth. And it's up to us as military professionals, legal professionals, to know which way that's swaying and give the other side of the story, if you will, or the what if, or, if you will, or the yeah, but before that decision's made. And we're going back to our natural role, I think.
Yeah, I think the drive is coming from the clients for more legal advice. It's not the lawyers trying to inject themselves. And I think that the real issue now is, I personally, and I want to be contradicted, I never saw rules of engagement that only met the minimum requirements of the law. There were always, 100% of the time, additional restrictions because of policy, not by law. And that's put in place by the political leadership. Kathy?
I'm not a lawyer, by the way. One of the few that are in the room, I'm sure.
No, actually, there's quite a few.
All of the non-lawyers can meet with me later. But I have 2 questions. One specifically for the Coast Guard, but the other one is a follow-on to this one. We talk a lot about the commanders and their feelings about the lawyers and the rules of engagement. A lot of the people who are actually doing the missions, the soldiers on the ground, the airmen flying in these missions, I don't know much about the Navy, sorry. But from those 2 realms, because I have 2 sons that serve, I said, they feel like they're always planning their defense as they're coming back after a mission. And that's from young captains, and my other son is a sergeant. And so I was curious as to, they don't really blame the lawyers, which is interesting, but they do blame the commanders because they said the commanders are not making the decisions. They're overboard on the legal part.
Risk adverse.
True or not, I don't know, but I'm just asking the question about how you feel about that. And the Coast Guard, I had a question. Since you do law enforcement also with the cyber thing, will you be able to, they're restricted as to what they can do looking into the United States of America. Are you have those same restrictions, or can you do more law enforcement type of things looking this direction rather than just out?
Great questions.
Sorry.
Gentlemen, you have 2 minutes, so do your Tom Brady thing and see, and let's.
Yeah. So we have, because we have a law enforcement authority, when you say look in, I mean, our focus is on the maritime realm. So, but in our law enforcement capacity, we can do the same thing that any other law enforcement agency can do. It's just we're limited to generally the maritime realm, maritime facilities. So if the FBI can do it in a law enforcement capacity, we can. But we also have the intelligence authorities, which are typically looking outward. So we do both.
And I'd just say, when it comes to whether you feel gun shy, it is a matter of training. I think Rock is just right, that we want to empower soldiers to get right up to what they can do. And that means training so they know exactly where the limit is. Once you know exactly where the limit is, then you'll operate to that limit. But I think it is a good thing to always, have a history of why you made those actions. And so I think some commanders do that. They want to ensure that there's a history and a record of what has been done. And in today's world, I think that's just good practice.
Yeah, I think, do you think it's a perception problem? Because there aren't that many prosecutions. I think my experience was that the force thought there were more prosecutions for things inadvertently done in combat, when actually they're pretty rare. But nevertheless, that perception's out there, and that affects the mindset.
It does, and Tom mentioned earlier about the Kunduz incident, the Doctors Without Borders, and that's what's driving a lot of, and that's a incredibly valid perception out in the field, because we held people accountable for something that is an inherently dangerous situation. They were up for days at a time without sleep in some very difficult circumstances, and we found a law of war violation there. It's an incredibly good point you make.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think that's a great point to leave on, because we'll have another panel this afternoon. We talk about civil-military relations and so forth. I think one of the real challenges for the legal profession, especially the military legal profession, is to understand the technology, understand war fighting, so that they can be the spokesman and explain to people in a real convincing way. And I think the Doctors Without Borders case is a good example. It's very easy to sit back in New York and say that should be considered a war crime before the investigation went on, like the Doctors Without Borders did. Not that I have any views on this, but as opposed to what's really going on. Okay, thank you very much.